3 out of 4 adults listening to this right now already have at least one chronic medical condition, and that is not even the most disturbing part. The real tragedy is this. We are living in the most hyper-connected health era in human history, and people have never felt more confused. We have health trackers on our wrists, apps scoring our sleep, influencers telling us what to eat, doctors giving one set of advice, podcasters giving another, and social media turning every meal into a moral decision. No wonder people feel paralyzed. Because the modern health problem is no longer just disease, it is information overload. And when you live in information overload long enough, one dangerous thing starts to happen. You keep following the old rules because they feel familiar. You keep believing that heart disease is mostly a cholesterol problem, that cancer is mostly bad luck or genetics, that weight loss is mostly willpower, that exercise is mainly about burning calories, that fiber is about digestion, and that sleep is just recovery. But the newer science tells a much more uncomfortable story. It says the reason so many people feel stuck is not because their bodies are broken. It is because they are still playing by the old rules. And those old rules may be quietly sabotaging their metabolism, their appetite, their inflammation, and their future disease risk. So today, we are cutting through the noise. In this report, we are breaking down the biggest health shifts now forcing medicine to rethink the old playbook. The truth about heart inflammation, the real biology behind appetite and GLP-1, the overlooked power of fiber and the gut, why cancer prevention matters more than most people realize, why movement is about health span, not punishment, and why poor sleep is not just fatigue, it is metabolic disruption. This is the clinical science they never taught you. Let's look at the data. For half a century, we were told to fight one main enemy, cholesterol, lower LDL, avoid eggs, fear butter, choose heart-healthy processed substitutes, track every lipid number like your life depends on it. And to be fair, cholesterol still matters. If LDL stays too high for too long, that can absolutely raise cardiovascular risk. So this is not a story about ignoring cholesterol. It is a story about understanding that cholesterol may be only one part of what drives a heart attack. Because cholesterol does not do damage in isolation. It interacts with the artery wall. It interacts with the immune system. And that is where the newer science starts changing the story. So the real question is no longer just, does cholesterol matter? It does. The real question is, why do some people still have heart attacks even when the old checklist does not fully explain it? That is where the old rule starts to crack. Scientific American reported that up to a quarter of people admitted with heart attacks had none of the 4 classic major risk factors: high blood pressure, smoking, high LDL cholesterol, or type 2 diabetes. In some analyses, those low-risk looking patients even had worse outcomes. In other words, some people looked relatively safe by the old checklist, right up until they were not. So what could be missing? Inflammation. Harvard's summary of the current cardiology debate says the evidence linking inflammation to heart disease is now considered compelling and clinically actionable, with inflammation being described as just as important as cholesterol in the development of atherosclerosis. Here is the easiest way to understand it. LDL is the wood. Inflammation is the match. Wood by itself is stored potential. It becomes dangerous when something ignites it. That is what chronic inflammation can do inside the artery wall. So yes, cholesterol matters. But the body is not only reacting to the amount of cholesterol, it is also reacting to whether the artery wall is irritated, inflamed, and biologically unstable. That is why the old question was, what's your cholesterol? But the newer question is, what's your inflammation level too? This is where a marker like hs-CRP matters. Harvard notes that below 1 mg per liter suggests lower cardiovascular risk, 1 to 3 mg per liter suggests average risk, and 3 mg per liter and above suggests higher cardiovascular risk. Now, let's be precise. Newer guideline explainers still make clear that LDL remains critically important, while also broadening the risk picture to include lifetime exposure, inflammation, blood sugar, ApoB, LPA, and more. Now, let's be precise. Newer guideline explainers still make clear that LDL remains critically important while also broadening the risk picture to include lifetime exposure, inflammation, blood sugar, ApoB, LPA, and more. So the forced rethink is not the cholesterol story was a lie, it is the cholesterol story was incomplete, and that is a very different thing. Because when people only hear lower LDL, they may miss the invisible fire running underneath it, and that fire can live inside the body for years before symptoms appear. So the new rule is this. New rule number 1. Heart disease is not only about cholesterol. It is also about inflammation, earlier hidden risk, and what is happening beneath the numbers. And if inflammation can quietly reshape the future of the heart, it can also reshape metabolism itself. Which takes us to the next shift. For years, weight loss was framed like a character test. Eat less, try harder, have more discipline, stop snacking, control yourself. And if you failed, the message was simple. You did not want it badly enough. But the GLP-1 era changed that story, not just because people started losing weight, but because it forced medicine and the public to confront something much more uncomfortable. Appetite is not just psychology, it is biology. That is why this topic exploded so fast. Pew found that 65% of Americans say willpower alone is usually not enough for most people to lose weight and keep it off. That is a major shift in how the public now thinks about obesity, and it helps explain why drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro became one of the biggest health stories in America. CDC data shows that in 2024, 26.5% of US adults with diagnosed diabetes were already using GLP-1 injectables. Pew also found that more than half of Americans hear or read about these drugs extremely or very often. So what exactly changed? The answer is not just weight. The answer is hunger. GLP-1 is a natural hormone released by the gut after you eat. It helps regulate appetite, fullness, insulin release, and blood sugar control. Prescription GLP-1 drugs mimic that signal in a stronger, longer-lasting way. That is why this is so much bigger than a diet trend. Because the real breakthrough is not simply that people eat less. The real breakthrough is that for some people, the internal pressure to keep eating starts to feel different. The constant pull feels quieter. The appetite feels less aggressive. The fullness signal lasts longer. And that is not just a feeling. Trials with liraglutide found more fullness, less planned food intake, and less desire for sweet, salty, fatty, and savory foods. That is a huge shift. Because once medicine proves that appetite can be changed biologically, the old just use more discipline story starts collapsing. But this is where the internet made the next mistake. It took one true idea that the body has natural satiety pathways and stretched it too far. Suddenly, everything became natural Ozempic, GLP-1 boosting supplements, nature's weight loss injection. This is where we need to slow down and be smarter. Because natural GLP-1 support is real, but natural GLP-1 replacement is hype. Better food quality, more fiber, slower eating, and a healthier gut can absolutely support satiety biology. That matters, but it is not the same thing as a prescription GLP-1 agonist working at a pharmacologic level. And the drugs themselves are not magic either. They are powerful, they are clinically meaningful, but they are also expensive, not equally effective for everyone, and not side effect free. Access remains uneven, and GI side effects are common. So the real lesson here is not medication beats lifestyle, and it is not natural beats medical. The real lesson is this: understand the biology first. Understand hunger. Understand fullness. Understand appetite signaling. Understand that the body is not simply failing a character test, because once you understand that, the whole conversation becomes more intelligent and more humane. So the new rule is this. New rule number 2. Stop treating appetite like a morality problem. Start treating it like a biological system. And once you do that, the next question becomes obvious. If appetite is biology, then what everyday foods are quietly shaping that biology in the first place? Which brings us to fiber. Most people still think fiber is about one thing: digestion, constipation, regularity, maybe cholesterol. And yes, fiber does help with those things, but that is only the surface, because the newer science says fiber is doing something much bigger than helping food move through the body. It is feeding an ecosystem inside you. That ecosystem is the gut microbiome, the community of microbes living in your colon. And those microbes are not just passive passengers, they are chemically active. They interact with your immune system, they influence inflammation, and they help shape the environment inside your gut. This is where fiber becomes much more interesting. When gut microbes ferment certain fibers, they produce compounds called short-chain fatty acids. The most important one for this conversation is butyrate. Now, if someone has never heard that word before, here is the simple version. Butyrate is one of the key compounds your gut bacteria make when they are well fed by fiber. And that matters because butyrate helps fuel colon cells, support the gut barrier, regulate local inflammation, and help maintain a healthier colon environment overall. In plain English, fiber is not just roughage. It is fuel for bacteria that help protect your colon. That is the big shift. And once you understand that, fiber stops sounding boring. It starts sounding biologically important. This is also where the cancer prevention side becomes powerful. The American Institute for Cancer Research recommends at least 30 grams of fiber a day and says every 10-gram increase in dietary fiber is linked to about a 7% lower risk of colorectal cancer. AICR also says that about 90 grams of whole grains a day is linked to roughly a 17% lower risk of colorectal cancer. That is a remarkable return from something as ordinary as food, because it means the colon is not just reacting to what you eat mechanically, it is reacting to what your gut microbes do with what you eat chemically. And when fiber intake stays too low for too long, the environment can shift in the wrong direction. Lower butyrate-producing bacteria, altered short-chain fatty acid metabolism, and a less protective colon environment. That is why this chapter matters so much. The question is not just, am I eating enough fiber to stay regular? The better question is, am I feeding the gut environment that helps protect me? And the answer is not exotic. It is not some miracle powder. It is not some expensive gut hack subscription. It is ordinary food repeated consistently. More beans, lentils, whole grains, vegetables, fruit, nuts, seeds. AICR gives very practical examples. Fruit instead of juice, whole wheat bread instead of white bread, vegetables instead of chips, and beans or lentils replacing part of the meat in a meal. That is also why the natural GLP-1 conversation became so interesting, because fiber is not just helping digestion, it is helping shape satiety biology, gut chemistry, and the environment of the colon itself. So the new rule is this. New rule number 3. Stop treating fiber like a digestion trick. Start treating it like microbiome fuel, satiety support, and colon protection. And once you understand that, the next chapter becomes unavoidable. Because if everyday exposures and everyday biology matter this much inside the colon, then the entire cancer conversation starts to look very different. Which brings us to prevention. Cancer is one of the few words that can change the emotional temperature of a room instantly. Because the moment people hear it, many of them think the same thing. Genetics. Bad luck, family history, hope it gets caught early. And to be fair, genetics do matter, family history does matter, and early detection still matters a great deal. But the newer data forces us to widen that picture. Because cancer is not only a story about what you inherit, it is also a story about what the body is exposed to, what kind of internal environment is being built over time, and whether warning signs are caught early enough. That is the real shift. The International Agency for Research on Cancer reported that in 2022, 48% of cancer deaths worldwide were avoidable through some combination of primary prevention, earlier detection, and better treatment access. That is an extraordinary number. And in the United States, the American Cancer Society says 44% of cancer deaths in 2026 are attributable to modifiable risk factors. Now, let's slow down and make that clear. This does not mean every cancer is preventable. It does not mean biology is irrelevant, and it does not mean anyone should blame themselves for getting sick. What it does mean is this. Prevention matters far more than many people realize, and that changes the whole emotional structure of the cancer conversation. Because if people believe cancer is almost entirely random, they tend to think of prevention as weak and treatment as everything. But the newer evidence says the picture is bigger than that. Major modifiable drivers include tobacco, alcohol, excess body weight, unhealthy diet, physical inactivity, certain infections, and ultraviolet radiation exposure. So the newer question is not just, how do we treat cancer once it appears? It is also, what kind of biological conditions are making cancer more likely to appear in the first place? That is why this chapter belongs right after fiber, because the body is not just reacting to one dramatic event, it is responding to repeated exposures, repeated inflammation, repeated metabolic stress, and repeated missed opportunities for prevention. And then there is timing. The National Cancer Institute emphasizes that prevention, screening, and early diagnosis can reduce cancer burden, and that many cancers are still found only after symptoms appear, not through screening alone. That matters because early detection is sometimes misunderstood. People hear it and think it only means advanced scans or big hospital systems. But often it also means noticing what changed, not ignoring symptoms, not delaying evaluation, and not waiting until something becomes impossible to miss. So the new cancer conversation is not prevention instead of detection, it is prevention and detection working together. That is the real upgrade. Because fear without control becomes paralysis, but fear with action becomes protection. So the new rule is this. New rule number 4. Cancer is not just a treatment story. It is also a prevention, exposure, and timing story. And once you understand that, the next question becomes just as important. If we want more years of life, how do we protect the quality of those years too? Which brings us to movement. For years, people treated one number like it was sacred, 10,000 steps. Hit 10,000 and the day felt healthy. Miss it and somehow it felt like the day did not count. That number became so powerful that millions of people stopped questioning it. It stopped feeling like a suggestion and started feeling like a law. But here is the problem. Most people were never taught to ask a very important question. What exactly are those steps doing for the body? Because movement is not just about accumulating numbers, and health is not built by chasing a digital badge. That is where the newer science changes the story. The old rule was simple: move to burn calories. But the new rule is much more powerful: move to protect health span. Now, if someone hears that word and thinks it sounds technical, here is the simple version. Lifespan is how long you live. Health span is how long you stay physically capable, mentally sharp, mobile, and independent while you are alive. That is a huge difference, because most people do not just want more years, they want more good years. Years where walking feels easy, where stairs do not feel like punishment, where balance still exists, where the brain still feels clear, and the body still feels like something you can trust. That is why movement matters so much. Not because it helps you earn food, not because it punishes the body into shrinking, but because it trains the body to stay usable. And this is where one of the most surprising findings comes in. CNN summarized research showing that fast walking for at least 15 minutes a day was linked to nearly a 20% lower risk of premature death, while much slower walking for longer showed a much smaller reduction. That is a very important shift, because it tells us something simple but powerful. It is not only about whether you move, it is also about how you move. The body does not respond to movement equally. 10,000 soft, mindless steps are not the same as 15 minutes that actually challenge your system. A gentle stroll is better than nothing, but to really challenge the system, the body often needs something more than motion. A gentle stroll is better than nothing, but to really challenge the system, the body often needs something more than motion. It needs a signal. It needs a reason to adapt. That is why walking speed matters. That is why cardiorespiratory fitness matters. That is why strength matters. That is why balance matters. The NIH review makes this even clearer. It argues that increasing physical activity and fitness may matter more for long-term morbidity and mortality than intentional weight loss alone. In other words, a more capable body may protect you more than a smaller body if the smaller body is still weak, unfit, or fragile. That is a major forced rethink, because a lot of people are still trapped in the old fitness mindset. Burn more, weigh less, repeat. But the better question is not, how much did I burn? The better question is, what did I train my body to become? Did you train it to use oxygen better, stay stronger, keep your balance, tolerate effort, protect your heart, keep your muscles active, preserve your independence? That is what health span training really is, and it does not have to begin with some heroic workout plan. That is another myth. Mayo supports brisk walking, interval walking, and building movement in practical ways. It also gives one of the most useful public definitions of brisk walking, a pace where you can still talk but not comfortably sing. That is so helpful because it turns exercise from something vague into something people can actually feel. So for many people, the right starting point is not a treadmill marathon, not a punishing boot camp, not an all or nothing gym identity. It is a daily pattern of meaningful movement, a brisk walk, an interval walk, a short session that actually challenges breathing, a resistance routine that keeps muscles alive, a pattern of movement the body recognizes as useful, because the body adapts to challenge, not to good intentions, not to step count guilt, and not to fitness fantasies. Because the real goal of movement is not appearance, it is durability, not look better, last better. And once you understand that, the whole emotional frame changes. Exercise stops feeling like punishment for eating. It starts feeling like insurance for the future. Insurance for your heart, your joints, your brain, your blood sugar, your balance, your independence. So the new rule is this. New rule number 5. Stop thinking of movement as punishment for eating. Start thinking of it as insurance for your future heart, brain, joints, and independence. And if movement helps build a stronger future body, sleep decides how stable that body's chemistry stays, which brings us to sleep. Most people think poor sleep mainly affects 3 things: mood, focus, and energy. And yes, it does affect those things, but metabolically, that is only the surface. Because sleep is not just time when the body shuts down, it is time when the body regulates. It helps regulate hunger, fullness, blood sugar, insulin sensitivity, cortisol rhythm, and long-term weight stability. That means poor sleep is not just a tiredness problem, it is a metabolic problem. And this is where the story becomes much more important than most people realize. Because when sleep gets cut short, the body does not stay neutral. It shifts. The hunger signals shift, the stress signals shift, the glucose response shifts, and the body becomes easier to push in the wrong direction. One of the clearest examples is the relationship between 2 hormones, leptin and ghrelin. If those names sound technical, here is the simple version. Leptin leptin helps signal fullness, ghrelin helps drive hunger. So ideally, you want those signals working in balance. But sleep restriction disrupts that balance. Controlled studies found that short sleep was associated with lower leptin, higher ghrelin, higher hunger, and higher appetite. In some trials, the shift was substantial, about 18 to 19% lower leptin, about 28% higher ghrelin, and noticeably higher hunger and appetite ratings overall. That means lack of sleep does not just make you tired enough to make worse choices, it can make the body itself want more food. That is a huge difference, because now the problem is not just discipline, the problem is biology, and the shift does not stop at appetite. Sleep loss also interferes with blood sugar control. And the shift does not stop at appetite. Sleep loss also interferes with blood sugar control. Laboratory studies found that even short-term sleep restrictions significantly impaired glucose tolerance and insulin-related metabolic control. In plain language, the sleep-deprived body becomes harder to regulate, hungrier, less satisfied, less glucose stable, more vulnerable to cravings, more vulnerable to overeating, more vulnerable to metabolic drift. That is why poor sleep so often shows up in real life as louder cravings, more snacking, late-night hunger, less patience, more emotional eating, and a body that suddenly feels harder to manage. And then there is another layer people often miss: timing. Because metabolism does not only care how much you sleep, it also cares when. Circadian disruption, irregular sleep, shift work, chronically missed time schedules has also been linked to obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular risk. That matters because the body runs on timing cues. Your internal clock helps organize glucose handling, cortisol rhythm, appetite signaling, hormone release, and metabolic readiness. So when sleep timing becomes chaotic, metabolism does not simply ignore it. It pays for it. That is the real shift. The old rule was sleep when you can. The new rule is protect sleep like part of your metabolic strategy, because sleep is not just rest. It is hunger control. It is blood sugar protection. It is cortisol regulation. It is appetite stability. It is long-term metabolic protection. So the new rule is this. New rule number 6. Sleep is not just recovery. It is hunger control, blood sugar protection, and metabolic stability. And once you understand that, the phrase, "I'll sleep when I have time," stops sounding harmless. It starts sounding expensive. And when you zoom out, that may be the biggest lesson of all. Because every chapter in this report points to the same deeper truth. The body is always responding to the signals you repeat, which brings us to the final synthesis. So what do all these shifts have in common? They all point to the same deeper truth. The old health story was too simple. It told you to lower cholesterol, eat less, move more, hope genetics are kind, and sleep later. But the newer story is more biological than that. It says health is shaped by systems, by inflammation, appetite signals, microbiome chemistry, movement quality, prevention, and sleep timing. In other words, your body is not just counting calories, it is interpreting inputs. And once you understand that, everything changes. You stop chasing health like punishment, and you start building it like strategy. So here is my question. Which of these shifts changed the way you think the most? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more of the clinical science they never taught you, subscribe to Axon Brief. I'll see you in the next report.